Welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, March 3rd of the LaRouche Organization. Tonight's topic is the lost chance of 1989 and the case of Lyndon LaRouche. And we will explain that in a moment. We want to first start by announcing something which involves the leader of our South African organization, Mr. Philip Sokalibane. He passed away yesterday at the age of 61, and for 10 years led the LaRouche Organization in South Africa, and was also very active throughout Africa. He came from a political family which was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. He worked with the Pan-African Congress, which was a breakaway from the African National Congress. He was actually around our organization from 1991, 31 years ago, and replaced the previous head of that organization began working to replace him in 2001. Basically, probably became most famous because of an intervention that was done in 2013 against President Barack Obama, who came to South Africa. And that was an occasion on which the infamous Obama mustache, or the Hitler mustache on Obama, was displayed on signs which were 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Various American press and press from around the world interviewed Philip at that occasion. And that was also the occasion where Obama gave the speech in which he talked about why Africans should not have cars and air conditioning, because if they demanded the same thing that others demanded, that the planet would boil over, ostensibly because of global warming. So he is survived by 2 adult children and is a brother, and more will be said about this as we learn more about it. But we thought that we should extend our condolences to his family. There is a statement that he wrote, which we will read after the presentation is made by Diane. So I want to say a few things about the issue of the topic. As people have been made unaware, there is a war that is going on in Europe and Asia, but it is not the war between Ukraine and Russia. It is a war that the City of London and Wall Street have declared on Russia and China. Now, this has been something that's been under discussion, and it's been talked about earlier. But there were, for example, 2 unnamed State Department officials who spoke about the idea of undermining the economy of Russia as early as January 28th. But when Russia and China issued their February 4th declaration, which essentially asserted that they had now achieved a form of alliance that was deeper than any alliance otherwise existing in the world, it became a kind of casus belli. And the notion was to create the context in which a shooting war already going on in Ukraine for 8 years, which had begun in 2014 and was being fought in eastern Ukraine, or where there were approximately 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers, approximately anyway, deployed. That war was then escalated. And what was being done, what is being represented as Russia's arbitrary incursion into Ukraine, was anything but that. This was the reason for the continuous requests and then demands by the nation of Russia for an answer by the United States and by NATO to their stipulation that there could be no arming of Ukraine either with nuclear weapons or with the placement of weapons in NATO territories, inclusive of Ukraine becoming a NATO territory. So there were a couple of demands that were made, and the notion was that there had to be something said in writing, since although statements had been made that there would be no weapons placed, the Russians could not afford to believe that, because they had earlier, from the 1990s, accepted verbal agreements that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward after 1990. They had accepted that, and what had occurred was that NATO had picked up 14 more countries after that, and had extended about 1,000 kilometers eastward. It also should be remembered that Russia itself was occupied by financial predators and speculators after the collapse of the Soviet Union, who came from the United States and came from Europe. And for a period of 8 years, that economy was looted by people from the West. So that has to also be taken into account when one looks at the actions that are done, whether you believe them to be justified or not. To state that they were unprovoked, or to state that they somehow came out of the blue, is not only grossly a gross distortion of reality, not only is it an outright lie, but it's actually a statement that is intended to escalate the present conflict into a complete thermonuclear confrontation. Now, the people saying those things may not know that, but to give you an example, earlier this week, Monday of this week actually, General Sir Richard Barrons, ex-head of the British Joint Forces Command, in a televised interview talking about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, stated a no-fly zone is feasible, meaning that NATO would declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Now, this is a very controversial measure because everybody understands that it's actually military, and it would mean that, therefore, NATO and Russia would be in a war. That means the United States would be in a war with Russia. And if that occurs, there is nothing short of total war between the United States and Russia, as the United States knows. So this character, General Sir Richard Barron, said, quote, a no-fly zone is feasible, so it's Monday night. By Wednesday, Russian heavy artillery will be around these Ukrainian cities, and they may be firing indiscriminately and destroying large chunks of the city and killing civilians. And when they do this, they will be 300 miles from the border with NATO and the European Union, a day's drive or half an hour in a military jet. So I think one of the issues for about Thursday or Friday of this week is, how does public opinion in the United Kingdom and other countries react to seeing people who look and live like us being slaughtered? And at that stage, I think there will be a different conversation led by public opinion about the application of NATO military power, perhaps through the sky and definitely against heavy weapons. So now, besides the fact that those statements are extraordinarily reckless, the important thing to recognize is that they are intended to provoke or to assist in provoking precisely the thing that is being warned about. A second statement that was made 2 days ago, which was made by the French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, talked about what he called the financial nuclear weapon to be used against Russia. He talked about waging an all-out financial and economic war against Russia. And what happened to him was that because he was making statements like that, he came to the attention of the former president of Russia, Medvedev, who basically said in print, watch your words, gentlemen, because financial wars then suddenly become, quote, real wars. Now, of course, there is no real difference between a financial war and a real war in today's world. People say, well, that's because no, people aren't killed in the financial war. That's ridiculous. Of course they're killed in a financial war. More people get killed in a financial war often than in a military shooting war. And so as what's important here is to recognize that this idea that the $2 trillion of financial speculation that exists in the transatlantic world is sacrosanct and it's going to have to be paid off when it can't be paid off. There is no amount of money in the world that can pay off that debt, about 95% of which has to be simply canceled, along with the so-called nominal financial value of it. And, of course, that's something that would cause the financial establishment, not merely, in fact, of the transatlantic world, but of all the other places as well, they would have immediate heart attacks and seizures about that. It would take them out of power. Instead of that, they want a Malthusian policy to depopulate the globe, to take any form of austerity measure against the population. And what they have to do is to goose the population to demand that austerity themselves. So right now, the idea is to goose the European population and also the American population, if possible, into advocating the austerity in terms of the high tax prices and all the other things, and you blame this all on Vladimir Putin. As one Italian economist said yesterday, or it could have been actually earlier today, perhaps Vladimir Putin should be given the Nobel Prize for medicine because he has apparently gotten rid of COVID since nobody talks about it anymore. So the idea is that Russia is to be used as the excuse and the reason for the massive looting of the transatlantic sector. And that is the thing that is an element of this financial warfare that has been brought about. So we are opposed to that economic policy direction. Yet at the same time, we have to give people a background on this, because the background actually begins in the 1980s, when exactly what Vladimir Putin was discussing 2 weeks ago in terms of the danger of the use of nuclear missiles and other and even conventional weapons against Russia by placing them right on the border and making the time very short between the launch of such a missile and its being sighted and the response. This was exactly what Lyndon LaRouche solved in 1981, 82, and 83, and which the Reagan administration adopted. That's what happened. So the issue, which was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was then rejected by the Soviet Union at that time, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union, then created a kind of moment where it was possible to completely reorganize the world in a positive direction, but that chance was lost. And what we want to do is to talk to you about Lyndon LaRouche, his role in that, and the lost chance of 1989 and its implications for today. So Diane Sare is going to give our presentation, to be followed by a question and answer period. So Diane, please go ahead.
Yep, great, thanks. So I'm going to start actually with the opening of the video that Helga Zepp-LaRouche released a few days ago, and I would really encourage everybody to make sure that you have seen this, the lies and truth about Ukraine, which is on the Schiller Institute website. It was released on Monday, the 28th, and she said, "I'm speaking to you because I want to give you an extremely important message. As you know, since a few days, Russian troops are in Ukraine in a military operation. As a reaction, the West has imposed very, very harsh sanctions on Russia, which are going to have incredible effects not only on Russia, but also on the whole world. President Putin has put the Russian nuclear weapons on alert. Any further escalation of this situation has the danger of things going completely out of control, and in the worst case, leading to a nuclear exchange and World War III. And if that happens, the chances are that nobody will survive this. It could be the extinction of the human species." Now, to understand how we got to this point, one has to look at the recent history of at least the last 30 years, because we have been sleepwalking from a point which was incredibly hopeful into a worsening of the situation step by step by step, and most people were completely indifferent to what was happening. You should remember that in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, many of the young people now were not even born then. They don't have a very good idea of what this period was. It was a moment of incredible historical potential because you could have built a peace order. Because the enemy was gone or about to go, the Soviet Union did not represent a threat anymore, because Gorbachev had agreed to the democratization of the Eastern European countries, and this is what we call a star hour of humanity, one of those rare moments when you can shape history for the better. So that's the intro, and she says more, but I'm going to come back to that because I want to go back and talk about Lyndon LaRouche's own work and what he comes out of, although if you would have talked to him, he said that he was at different points at least 200 years old and other points 2,500 years old. So very conscious of his identity as being a product of the development of Western civilization from Socrates on, and then his dinners with his, I think, maternal uncle, great uncle, who had run a station on the Underground Railroad in Ohio. But at any rate, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, he made a decision, although coming from a long Quaker tradition of pacifism, to enlist as a medic in the military in World War II. And he initially was, I guess, in Texas and other places training new recruits. He said if it depended on our recruits, we would have definitely lost the war, but happily coming out of the Depression and so on, it was a real crash program to get people in shape. But because of what FDR did with the massive industrial buildup, which was able to be retooled, the auto plants were able to be retooled to produce tanks and planes and all kinds of things. We were able to supply the Soviet Union, the Allied forces, and ourselves, and to defeat Hitler ultimately, with a major role played by the Soviet Union, which lost 27 million people in that war. Now, if you think back, and I know Jerry Rose was on this, was it last week maybe? Or was it last week, Dennis? Or 2
Yes.
weeks ago? Okay, last week. And has been discussing Franklin Roosevelt and his outlook. Just to reiterate, FDR was very adamant with Winston Churchill that the United States, in entering this war, had no intention of leaving the world divided between overlords and colonies. And he was very explicit in conversations with his son, Elliot, that if you did not change the system, if you did not allow every nation to have its independence and to have a full set industrial economy, then we would find ourselves right back in war again, because that is the oppression of human beings, the oppression of the natural impulse for development, ultimately will be the cause for war. And I think it's worth reflecting, although the British prolonged the war deliberately, probably, most likely, to ensure that FDR would be dead by the time the war ended, so he couldn't impose his outrageous American views on the world. Nonetheless, this carried on in two cases. In the Reconstruction of Germany, the Marshall Plan, I mean, think about this. This was where Hitler came from. This was the enemy. In the mentality today, you would say, well, we should have just leveled them to the ground and left it a heap of, rubble. And Japan, which we nearly did, because after FDR died, Truman decided to drop the nuclear bombs, which were unnecessary since, thanks to MacArthur's extremely effective naval blockade, the emperor was already in the process of negotiating a surrender. But even then, when MacArthur became responsible for Japan, what was his impulse? It was one of agape. He loved the people of Japan. He wanted them to be liberated from fascism. He knew of an earlier tradition there, influenced very much by the United States. His father had been there at the turn of the century. So he knew there was something to draw on, and look at Japan today, extraordinary. Now try and imagine, although our war against Iraq both times in 91 and 2003 was completely illegitimate, but imagine for some reason it had been legitimate to have a war with Iraq. And imagine that the United States had the same identity as we had in Franklin Roosevelt. What would Iraq look like today? It would be a thriving, beautiful, prosperous nation with a high standard of living, with all of the best contributions from the Islamic Renaissance brought forth. The deserts would be greened. There would be, it's almost unimaginable. We've taken it so for granted somehow that you have these never-ending wars for no purpose, and you have no conception whatsoever of what victory looks like, although this was some people's conception, but I will get to that. So FDR died. The war ended, but before FDR's body was even cold, Truman was underway ripping up everything, and by 1946 we had the famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, and suddenly the Allies that had successfully defeated Hitler were now enemies. And LaRouche came back from the war and worked in management consulting, but he was observing already a kind of degeneracy. He would talk about and you had, after the death of FDR, the McCarthyite witch hunt. So everyone was terrified of being accused of being a communist. You wanted to keep your nose clean, not get in trouble. People would say, look, you've been away in the war for so long now, don't rock the boat, don't worry about right or wrong, just keep your job. And he said the World War II generation shrunk. They became smaller. They became practical and pragmatic, looking out for themselves, not thinking of society, and then had the baby boomer generation who grew up in a total cultural onslaught. Already by the 1950s, LaRouche was looking at the automobile industry and saw that somehow the value of the loan for your car was deemed more valuable than the car. The loan lasted longer than the life of the automobile. And he said, when I saw that, I knew we were doomed, because the economy had shifted out of reality to this bubble. And then later in 71, he warned that Nixon was going to bring down the Bretton Woods system under pressure, under actions from Britain, and then advice of George Shultz. Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold reserve system. And at that point, 71 was the end of any kind of stability or sanity in the international economy. Currencies could float and, shift wildly against each other. And we went from a point where trade, international trade, money changing hands overseas was tied to physical production or trade in goods, to a situation where probably 99.9% of all foreign exchange had nothing whatsoever to do with anything physical produced, but only speculation. And that created problems, as we'll see. And you had at the same time, and this is what LaRouche was warning. So you had a reprieve from that with the Kennedy presidency. Kennedy got back to building infrastructure. He had an ongoing dialogue with Eleanor Roosevelt. He opposed the Vietnam War. He successfully negotiated the Cuban Missiles Crisis. And he launched the space program, which had enormous benefits for the U.S. economy, and he was assassinated. And you had Malcolm X being assassinated, Martin Luther King assassinated, and Bobby Kennedy assassinated. 4 major assassinations in a 5-year period, and the Vietnam War, which Kennedy would have stopped, and the idea of the rock, drug, sex, counterculture, and Earth Day. So there was a shift from optimism, from the idea that human beings are good, it's good for human beings to transform nature, to an idea, no, Mother Earth is good, the trees are good, and human creativity actually is destructive because it destroys Mother Earth, Mother Nature. And you had a terrible shift. And LaRouche began creating this organization, and he warned that this shift would destroy the United States and Western civilization. He talked about a total collapse. Now, after this, he created something called the Fusion Energy Foundation. He also fought in the 70s for something called the International Development Bank. The image that FDR had for the world was the image LaRouche had, that every nation should be able to be gotten out of poverty. And he was organizing governments and heads of state, leaders of the non-aligned movement like Indira Gandhi, Fred Wills, the former ambassador from Guyana to the UN and former justice minister of Guyana, and Lopez Portillo, the president of Mexico, and had meetings with many, many others to try and put together a concert of nations that as a bloc would be powerful enough to overcome the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And Henry Kissinger in 1982 wrote a letter to the FBI saying the LaRouche people were getting obnoxious, something should be done about them. It became a real threat to the system. Also in that time, in the 70s and 80s, he conceived of the idea from his work for fusion energy, made the acquaintance of Edward Teller at Lawrence Livermore Labs, and began a dialogue with him about whether or not we could develop a laser system which could prevent nuclear missiles from hitting the Earth. That could you use laser beams to knock out nuclear warheads before they hit? In other words, was there some way to get this crazy arms race, this mutual and assured destruction, where the only way to avoid nuclear war was to have more missiles than the other guy? And you would know that, as Eisenhower said, the only thing worse than losing a nuclear war would be winning a nuclear war, because there would be nothing left. So they concluded this would work, and it would serve a double purpose. One, of ending this mutual and assured destruction, ending the Cold War, because the only way you could build this is for the United States and the Soviet Union to develop it simultaneously. And because we didn't have the technology, it would serve as a driver in the same way the space program under Kennedy had worked. So in 1980, Lyndon LaRouche was running for president. He was in a debate in New Hampshire. He happened to be seated next to Ronald Reagan, and he was able to talk to Reagan about his vision of ending mutual and assured destruction with laser defense. Reagan was one of those unfortunately rare individuals who recognized that nuclear war is the end of everything. He loved the proposal, and when he won the election, he invited Mr. LaRouche to Washington, and Reagan personally became committed to this policy. And in 1983, Reagan announced that the United States was going to build the Strategic Defense Initiative, that this would render nuclear missiles impotent and obsolete. Now, LaRouche was negotiating with the Soviet Union, and they rejected Reagan's offer. They said, no, we're not going to build this with you because we're in a Cold War. your economy, we saw what happened with the space program. You got all these spin-offs that made every, $10 for every dollar invested, laptops and microwaves and cell phones and all of these things. Our economy doesn't function that way. We're pouring everything into defense, and it doesn't spin off or get into other sectors. So if we do this, you're going to win the Cold War. So no, we're not going to do it, and we're going to try and make you stop it. And LaRouche told the Soviets, if you reject Reagan's offer, this was 1982, you are going to cannibalize your economy trying to go off and build this on your own, and you are going to go bankrupt and disintegrate in 5 years. And 6 years later, that's exactly what occurred. Because of this policy and because it existed, as the Soviet system collapsed, it was possible that the Berlin Wall could come down, that nations could be liberated without war, without massive violence. And in fact, in 1988, after LaRouche was indicted by Robert Mueller in 87, and before that in 86, just to try and really get him out of the way when Reagan was on his way to meet with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, where Gorbachev was going to try with all his might to get Reagan to drop the SDI, the Welds, the Bush family, some grouping organized a raid on LaRouche's house. 400 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, armored vehicle carriers. Somehow people know the routine. NBC News was right there. Just, NBC often hangs out on dirt roads in Leesburg, Virginia at 5 o'clock in the morning, waiting to see if there's going to be FBI raids of any notable figures. So this was all over national television. And although we found out later that the intent was actually to assassinate LaRouche at this time, he managed to get a telegram to Reagan, who ordered them to back down and cut it out. But this set in motion, or was part of an ongoing, but really escalated at that point because it was clear LaRouche candidates were winning elections. They were winning Democratic primaries around the country. We had succeeded in getting Ronald Reagan to go with his program. There were leaders of many nations prepared to go with this. So LaRouche had to be stopped at all costs. And therefore, he had already been indicted in 1987. In 1988, he and Helga Zepp-LaRouche went to Berlin, the Kempinski Hotel, and he delivered a speech calling for the reunification of Germany. And most of us, I was a college student at the time, I thought, well, this is quite unusual. Why is an American presidential candidate over there in Germany talking about the Berlin Wall come down? And I didn't know anything about the history of World War II or when the wall had come up, but it seemed to me very unusual, to say the least. No one thought the Berlin Wall was going to come down. And LaRouche made a specific proposal that in return for the West feeding Poland, alleviating the food shortages in Poland, that the Soviet Union should allow the reunification of Germany. Well, 1 year later, LaRouche was in prison and the Berlin Wall came down. And that's the moment that Helga's talking about, where you had an incredible opportunity that this old Soviet system, as LaRouche had said, had completely disintegrated. But the West had not abandoned the rotten policies that were collapsing the West. And what Lynn from prison and Helga proposed is you should take this opportunity and change the orientation, take the industrial might of Germany and move it eastward and develop the entire eastern region. And that was absolutely not to be allowed. And in fact, in that time, Germany was, the wall came down in 89. Germany was reunified a year later in November of 1990, and there were very intense negotiations where, contrary to the lying news media, the Russians were promised, and there are many witnesses now coming forward, that James Baker III, in a February 1990 meeting with Gorbachev, promised that that NATO would not expand in return for the reunification of Germany. There was also a shift in U.S. policy, very ugly, which involved Dick Cheney, and you just have to say Cheney and you know it's ugly, who had been in the Congress in 1989, but then he became the Secretary of Defense for Bush 41. And in May of 1990, so 5 months after we have promised emphatically that NATO will not expand, Germany should be reunified, it happens November of that year, Cheney's in there as Secretary of Defense, and they begin a policy debate between Cheney's group, which is Wolfowitz, Cheney, etc., and the Joint Chiefs of Staff led by General Colin Powell. And the debate was what was the future now that the Soviet Union was no longer a threat. And what Cheney and Wolfowitz argued, and they won the debate, is that there had to be a new mission, a neo-imperial mission for the United States, premised on the idea that no nation or combination of nations would be allowed to match American economic, military, or political power. So this was the turning point where it was decided that, and it was codified later in January of 93, that the United States was going to be the sole superpower, and the way we're going to keep that status is by making sure that nobody ever surpassed us. Now, it would be one thing to say, well, no one's ever going to surpass us because we are going to work our butts off. We're going to develop fusion. We're going to develop lasers. We're going to cure cancer. We're going to eradicate poverty. But that wasn't the idea. The idea was we are decaying. We are post-industrial. We're going with sex, drugs, rock, prostitution, etc., drug, legalize everything, destroy ourselves. And therefore, if people are not going to surpass us, we have to impose the most brutal, vicious, horrific policies, because if we're committed to that kind of decline, the only way to make sure people don't surpass us is to escalate their decline and really grind it in. So instead of the LaRouche's program for the development of the East, what did we do? We had wars, war upon war upon war. We had the first Iraq War in 1991, where Saddam Hussein was told by the U.S. ambassador that he could go ahead and invade Kuwait and the United States would not do anything. Then people remember the propaganda, Iraqi soldiers yanking babies out of incubators. We have to go in there. We had the Iraq War. We had the invasion of Panama. That was already in December of '89, right after the Berlin Wall came down, where we're blaring rock music and capturing Noriega because he didn't want to participate in the drug trade in the way that we were running up it. Then you had later in '99 the bombing of Yugoslavia, where somehow we quote unquote accidentally blew up the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. We had bombing in Sudan, where we blew up I think it was a baby milk powder factory. So we didn't develop, but we wanted to make sure that everyone stayed worse off than we were. And what we had toward the east was this horrible shock therapy, where the population of Russia was actually shrinking by 1 million a year. Now, one of the reasons why people like Putin so much, and Medvedev and Primakov, basically these leaders reversed that policy. They reversed the looting of Russia in that way. They fought back to change the situation. In 1996, Helga went to Beijing. She proposed building the new Silk Road. China did not adopt that policy at that time. They were still sort of stuck in Bush's free trade zones, but it percolated. And what happened was that this fight became more and more intense, more and escalated. And then we had 2001, remember 9/11, 2001, another, frankly, ratcheting down, where you have an event. LaRouche says, don't blame Osama bin Laden. We have to talk to Russia. Putin was the first head of state to talk with Bush and said he was standing down his missiles. The Russians were going to give us full support in getting to the bottom of this. And what do? That's a pretext for 22 more years of war. Now, if you think about what Lyndon LaRouche was trying to do, and the fact that he was explicitly in prison at the time that you had this breakthrough, and not only that, but his newspaper was shut down. He was called every name in the book, and people became terrified of being associated with him. And then also the head of Deutsche Bank, who would have had policies of this kind of economic development toward Russia, was Alfred Herrhausen, was assassinated. You see what's gone into this fight, not only for us to be bankrupt, but for us to ensure that everybody else is more bankrupt than we are. It's really ugly. And that's where you come to what was said. Actually, it was the White House press briefing, January 25th, that Dennis referenced earlier. The goal is, quote, hit Putin's strategic ambitions to industrialize his economy quite hard, undercut Putin's aspirations to exert influence on the world stage. We're talking about denying to Russia downstream products that are critical to its own ambitions to develop high-tech capabilities in aerospace, defense, laser sensors, maritime. So think about that. Think about Franklin Roosevelt. Think about the American Revolution, freedom against empire. FDR, liberate the colonies, prosperity, nations develop, you have peace. And then you think about the shift. We are destroying ourselves, but not only that, we want to make you suffer more than we are. We're going to destroy you faster than we are. So is Putin paranoid to think that there's a design to destroy Russia? Apparently not. And the same thing with China, where Klaus Schwab of the Great Reset has explicitly said that it's most unfortunate that eradicating poverty involves the use of fossil fuels, and we really can't have that because that'll destroy the earth. Well, China's gotten 850 million people out of poverty. So now you come to the situation, which is supposedly between Russia and Ukraine, and what you see is it has nothing to do with Ukraine really at all. And unfortunately, I don't know if the leaders of Ukraine have woken up to the fact that the people in this game, the people running this game, which are, I don't know if Biden runs much of anything but him, the people behind him, and emphatically the British, and Christopher Steele of the Steele dossier, who helped orchestrate the coup in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014, they're perfectly happy to just grind Ukraine and all the people into the mud, getting more people to come in there and fight, as long as they can prolong the misery and blame Putin for everything, and then including imposing bone-crushing sanctions as best they can on Russia. But because our economy is so fragile, for example, Russia produces a huge amount of the world's fertilizer. So if no one's allowed to buy that, we're not going to have any fertilizer. We're going to have more people starving than we already have. It's sort of like a guy who goes in to rob a bank and points the gun at his own head and says, give me all your cash or I'll shoot. This is what we're doing. It really is like a kind of an insane endgame. And it's in this context that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has said that the only thing to be done now, the only way out, is we need an urgent conference of nations to agree, as in the Treaty of Westphalia, that they will act in the interest of the other, that no one will take an action which jeopardizes anyone else's security. And you have to see LaRouche and our movement as being integral to this whole process and the potential that it could happen it may require the realization that if we don't do it, we're all going to be dead. I'm hoping that that's becoming clear to people. It seems to me that it is by the response that we're getting, Harley Schlanger, myself, and others on some of the material we're posting, where we're getting tens of thousands of views and, people coming on board. But we're at the point where these two systems, what you could call the American system, the human system, or the British imperial looting rotten system of Dick Cheney et al., can no longer coexist. And the last thing I want to say about Ukraine in particular is, since the coup orchestrated by Obama with his own, I think, Undersecretary of State for Europe or something like that, Victoria Nuland, caught on the phone saying exactly who was going to be put in power, putting in power a bunch of neo-Nazis who have been shelling and bombing the Donbass region for 8 years, killing 14,000 people, and then refusing to listen when Putin said it is not acceptable for NATO to expand or for Ukraine to have nuclear weapons, and that he would not countenance genocide, ethnic cleansing of the Russian population in the East. All of this was ignored. It was as if to deliberately, since he was very clear, he never lied about what his red lines were, so to speak, unacceptable conditions, to create this situation where we are today. But the only way out is to change the whole entire thing, as Helga has proposed, as Lyndon LaRouche would have proposed. And I would also say here that this is why, in this centennial of LaRouche's birth, his exoneration is one of the most critical flanks on the whole situation, because clearing LaRouche's name would be an indication that the United States had returned to its actually proper identity.